with the interfering cases. These are the interference cases blown up. So recall that here we saw this significant difference between ASL and BSL. In LEASE and in HKSL, the interference is going both ways. So it's like they're not being very systematic. But my intuition was that there was systematicity, we just didn't know where to find it. So I started to think about some of the early work in the 80s and 90s about nominalization. And this quote is from Birgich, but it could have been from any one of them. Derived nouns that have argument structure inherit this in some form from their verbal source. So typically in spoken languages, the nouns sort of fossilize what is maybe more manipulable, flexible in the verbal form. So you can test the verbal forms for what different types of argument structure they have, and sometimes those will become fossilized in a noun, like let's say televised television. The same sorts of argument structure are in the lexical semantics of the verb. And so what I started to think was that when Patton saw those preferences, in some ways, part of the problem with the mixed cases is that there was something going on in the lexical semantics of the verbs. And that argument structure might play an important role in deciding which type of handshake would be used. So we went back to the verbal vignettes that I showed people. And, we weren't controlling for this. So this is sort of a post hoc analysis that is sort of still in progress. But we wanted to see how these different sign languages treated the act-on verbs that didn't have an instrument, the ones that just had a direct object, and the ones that were mediated by an instrument. And so on the left-hand side, we see the ones that are not mediated by an instrument, like lollipop, eat a lollipop. And the ones that are mediated by an instrument on the right, like close blocks with tape. And what you see is all of the sign languages, when you're dealing with a direct object act-on verb, prefer handling handshakes. They behave alike. But when there's an instrument involved, notice, ASL and BSL, there's a tiny bit of difference, but there's still an overwhelming preference for handling handshakes. Look how big those blue bars are. But in LEASE and HKSL, when you use an instrument in the predicate, it changes the dynamic, it changes the pattern such that there is no preference anymore. So there are many, many more object handshakes that appear in LEASE and HKSL in these instrumental forms. So I suppose I was thinking, and still am thinking, that perhaps there's a difference in the way that these languages treat instrumentals. In some languages, instrumentals are treated like an argument, like an actual argument of the verb, like a direct object. In other languages, they're treated like additional information, adjuncts. And so it could be that LEASE and HKSL are treating the instruments more like arguments, and in ASL and BSL, they're treating them more like adjuncts. And here's just an example of a LEASE signer, Italian signer, signing some instrument verbs. And she uses object handshakes for all of them. So these are forms that you, in ASL or BSL, you would see handling handshakes. So the point is that the lexical semantics of the verb matter. and that ASL and BSL aren't instrument sensitive, but HKSL and LEAS are. And so we can go back and now fill in the 4 cells with the 4 different types of languages. We have a handling handshake preference language, BSL, that isn't instrument sensitive, and we have one that is. We have one object handshake preference language that isn't instrument sensitive, and that's ASL, and we have one that is, and that's LEAS. So right now, I'm basically I'm basing my analysis just on these distributional facts. But what I really need to do now is do some serious work trying to develop some diagnostic tests to figure out what these languages are doing with these instrument arguments. And some things that have come to mind are the typicality or the atypicality of the event. So you can eat something with a fork, or you can comb your hair with a fork, right? You can tie a bow with string, which is typical, or you can cut cheese with string, which is atypical. So I'm wondering if in fact there are distinct differences in the way these 2 different sign languages deal with typicality and atypicality. The other thing that I'm curious about is whether phonology is a relevant factor, because sign languages seem to have a lot of interaction between morphology and phonology. The meaningful parts of the languages and the phonological, the meaningless part of the languages tend to interact a lot. And I'm thinking that one hypothesis could be that when the handshake becomes more complicated, like a handshake like airplane, you might see it in the instrument cases more frequently, or even a 2-fingered handshake, rather than a simple handshake, which simple handshakes are 1 and 5. So I'm going to devise a task where I separate typicality and atypicality in terms of event structure, and complex and simple handshakes. And then the third possibility is that there's some interesting thing going on between the 2 parts of these predicates. And in fact, you can see that these are 2 parts of a predicate from early work by my host, Ray Jacketoff. So he started working on these back in the 80s, where Sue hit Fred with a stick is a combination of Sue interacting with the stick and the stick interacting with Fred. So in a certain sense, you might wonder whether the relationship between these 2 parts of the predicate, there might be variation here and the way that languages treat or prioritize or emphasize or bring to bear one part of this predicate over the other. So for example, so far, we might think that HKSL and LEAS are actually emphasizing the second part because they're using the object handshake and they're emphasizing the stick-on thread. Whereas ASL and BSL are emphasizing the first part of this predicate because they're emphasizing the Sue acting on the stick, the holding of the stick. So that's one possibility. And I've collected only a little bit of data so far, but I want to show you what I have on the typicality and atypicality. So what I'm going to show you here are for about 11 different objects. I had one vignette that was atypical. So the 11 objects were like tape and string and airplane, coin. And the 2 that you're going to see here are, there's you'll see the stimulus. The typical one for coin is drop a coin in a change purse. The atypical one is use a coin to screw something into a plate. And then for the airplane, you have a toy airplane, and the typical one is somebody playing with the airplane. And the atypical one is someone digging in dirt with an airplane, with a toy airplane. And you'll see that in the ASL, which is non-instrument sensitive, and in HKSL, Hong Kong Sign Language, which is instrument sensitive, that the typical events both elicit handling handshakes. But the atypical events behave differently. So the HKSL, the Hong Kong Sign Language, elicits an object handshake in both of the atypical cases. So this is going to go on for about 3 minutes, and just kind of watch them. They're first shown, the stimulus is shown, then there's a slide that tells you that it's the sign language, which sign language it is, and then it shows it to you first at full speed, and then at half speed. The yellow is the actual form we're interested in. So that's a hand language. And an ASL will be the same. Now the atypical. We'll show one more example. So those are the first data that I have indicating that the sign languages that are instrument sensitive treat these atypical events differently than a sign language that is not instrument sensitive. But that's not enough. I also want to be able to come up with some definitive grammatical tests, syntactic tests, which are like they're magic. You have to sort of work on them for a long time before they actually come to fruition. But when I looked at these atypical events, you can see that ASL and BSL use object handshakes very rarely in these atypical cases. Less like 0.01% for ASL and just around 10. But what's interesting is I also divided this into airplane, which is a complex handshake, and lollipop, which is a simple handshake. And you see that even in the two instrument-sensitive languages, Hong Kong Sign Language seems to also be sensitive to the complexity of the handshake. So what I'm going to do next is actually control for those two factors and any others I can think of to try to determine for sure whether it's the instrument, the instrumentality, the instrument arguments that are driving this distinction. But either way, what we've found, to sum up now, is that these typological categories are based on both the iconic preferences that Patton found in the first place and the whole organization of argument structure. So the lexical semantics of the verb really do seem to be different in both of these types of sign languages, and ultimately the nouns derived from them will be influenced by them. And once you deal with the issues of lexical semantics and the iconic preference for handshake, both of those things together then feed into the classifier system. So it's as if you've only got one protagonist in a language like ASL and BSL. That protagonist is the iconic preference. But in languages like Hong Kong Sign Language and LIS, you have two protagonists, instrument sensitivity and the iconic preference. So there are implicational statements that can be applied to sign language in the way that Greenberg applied his to spoken languages. So if a sign language has a handshake preference that's handling, the agentive distinction in classifiers will be effective. There will be more handling handshakes in no agent contexts. If a sign language is instrument sensitive, it will also have an effect on the nouns derived from those act-on predicates and on the agent, no agent distinction in classifier predicates. And so now we can actually find an explanation for that set of languages that Patton thought were mixed, that she didn't have a good pattern for. And we can also see how ASL and BSL fit into a larger pattern of typological categories. That's all. Thank you.
Can I ask a question? First, it was fantastic. I thought as you were describing it, would it be valuable to design a test or to design some sort of an evaluative measure that was receptive, where you gave everybody the option for either type, and to see what if they would select the preference rather than this sort of expressive opportunity? Because in some ways, I think there might be there might be different results given all these potential options, foils and the handling as opposed to the instrument options, and then one other option. Have you thought about that, or have you done that sort of thing?
I haven't done it yet, but it's a very good suggestion, and I will think about that because you're right. There's every reason to believe that it should be evident in perception as well as production, and it might be easier to access the intuitions of people with a simple perception task rather than production task where you're trying to elicit these. So thank you, that's a really great idea.
What would some of the other parameters be in this typology? Beyond handshake of instruments versus objects? What other sorts of parameters would?
We're going to typology.
Yeah.
I was thinking the use of movement. That is to say, one thing that is a understudied or maybe not yet studied area of research is what movements and what handshapes go together, not in classifier predicates where they're productive and you can sort of substitute the handshapes all the time, but in the actual lexicon. And what kinds of movements go with what kinds of handshapes and the relationship there. And perhaps there will also be some things to pull out of the movement parameter as well. That's the only thing I can think of, but there certainly might be others. Do you have some thoughts?
Not immediately.
Okay. Yes?
I think that it's interesting to think about the, you mentioned iconicity several times, and to think about how there's also a question in the psycholinguistic processing of the signs about how much iconicity matters in general as sort of, and what I'm thinking by is that the iconicity that you're mentioning is, it's iconic in the sense that there's a relationship to the meaning of it, but it's still arbitrary in some ways and structured, and even in the languages where it varies, it's the fact, like just what you mentioned at the end, using a non-canonical, using an airplane. There's no reason why you should show the airplane shape for the non-canonical thing rather than for the digging. So I'm wondering, because I was trying to think about, well, these languages differ in their use of the iconicity, as you talked about it. And I was thinking about whether then maybe they differ in certain psycholinguistic processing of the role of iconicity, but it's still not iconicity in the sense of straight up visual, a one-to-one relationship. And I was wondering if you thought about this sort of this dual nature of the iconicity.
I am so happy you brought that up because people have spoken for, as long as there have been people studying sign languages about iconicity, and have sort of assumed or implied that there's some sort of competition that either something is iconic or is arbitrary. And all of this work, even though I didn't say it explicitly, thank you for giving me the opportunity to say it now, they're not in competition at all. Just because something has an iconic source, it doesn't mean that its distribution and its function within the grammar can be completely arbitrary. And so the fact that these handshapes kind of, have this relationship to objects in the world in some way that's undeniable, that has nothing to detract from their use as fully grammatical objects within the linguistic system. And it doesn't even matter that they look like maybe even gestural forms that you might see. The difference between the gestural form and the sign form is that maybe the gesture form doesn't sort of look systematic when you look at its distribution, where in a sign language, that iconicity, that same form, has its place, and it's either grammatical or not, or it's used for this function or not, and so it's really about the distribution and not about the source. So thank you.
I'm interested in idea, and you mentioned it at one point, but that you can have both versions. So I'm thinking in ASL, you can have a lot of signs like pencil, where you could show it with the hand or with the object. You can do toothbrush or brush or many of these things. You can do both ways. Some of them, and so I wonder what your thoughts are on kind of the frequency. It occurs to me that maybe some are used more frequently in some cases, or some are the more kind of preferred versions of it, but you still can have these other variants. And I'm wondering if you've thought about why or how that might be distributed.
Right. You could see from all of my figures, it was never 100 and 0, or even 98 and 2 or something. There was always quite a bit of variation. It was a tendency. And I have a feeling, although I don't have any evidence yet to back this up, that some of this variability comes from dialectal variation, from generational variation, and so there may be other things that we don't understand quite yet. I suppose I've taken the lesson from the sociolinguistic playbook, though. A rule is something that is statistically robust. And so in this case, the things that I'm reporting on are statistically robust, even if if there's variation. Variation I'm going to treat as noise, although it's not noise. There's something to be understood there, but I just don't know how to address that yet.
I'm sorry, another question, but as you were talking close to the end, specifically about the relationship nature of how we want to depict what happens in these events, I think that there's, I mean, just as sort of on an intuitive level, there seems to be something there that could be overcome if you sort of let the sentence be a little bit longer and include both relationships. Like, for example, if you, the example is, what was it? It was Sue hit stick in the head, Sue hit Fred in the head with a stick, right? So the idea is you would have the instrument class, in American Sign Language, you would have this relationship, Sue with the stick relationship. But then if you wanted to say, and it hit Fred right in the head, you would, change it to that. So I think that, the same idea is that someone would throw a pencil and the pencil fell over a cliff. So I think that if you allowed for an extended sentence where the relationships changed, where you wanted to sort of describe this idea that there's this agent to an object relationship, and all of a sudden now this object has a different relationship, a prepositional relationship or whatever with something else. I think it might, I think it informs a lot of what you're talking about, but I think that if you extended the opportunity for people to say not just, there was a hitting action that took place, but there was a hitting action that took place, and then there was a result, a relationship between that object and whatever it hit or whatever you're talking about. I'm not sure if that's helpful or not, but I think that when you said that, I think there's really something there. There's something, if you allow it to go that far.
Yes, yes. I've been trying to think about that because in the sign languages that I'm familiar with, that happens a lot, what you just said, the splitting up of the two pieces. And there are even ones here that I didn't show you that are like that, where you see the agentive part and then you see the non-agentive part and showing the reaction of the person hit, let's say.
Right.
And there are certain, I have this intuition that there are certain predispositions that the object handshake with the location have to offer that the agentive handshake, the handling handshake, doesn't offer, and vice versa. And so I want to think about that a little bit and then play with it and manipulate those combinations of pieces. And that's kind of why I put those two pieces up there. Because there's even a paper on Hong Kong Sign Language versus ASL on these, they called them serial verb constructions, where it showed the agentive, or sort of one part, and then the resultant part, where you had like someone kicking a box full of sticks, and then the sticks scattering. And there were structural properties that were present in the Hong Kong case, but not the ASL case. For example, the non-dominant and hung around. It extended through the second part. In ASL, if you get them as two separate things. So there may be sort of hints in other parts of the predicate system that I want to try to investigate some more on these four different sign language types.